There's only one video game console manufacturer that has been around since the quote-unquote console boom: Nintendo. The video game console market completely crashed in 1983, and Nintendo was instrumental in reviving it, and they just never stopped. So how has a playing card company founded in 1889 managed to dominate the console industry for the last several decades? A huge part of that answer is hardware. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanx, the evolution of Nintendo consoles. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a market appeared for home video game consoles. You had everything from the ColecoVision to the Intellivision to the Atari 2600, and a profitable way to get in on that phenomenon was to make games for them. Over the last decade, a company called Nintendo that had already been around for roughly a century was finding success in arcades with a game called Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong got ported to and packaged with the ColecoVision in North America. It was a hit, and it convinced the Nintendo executives and R&D department that they should have been working on their own hardware. Through the early 80s, they did just that, and in 1983, they released the Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the Family Computer or Famicom in Japan, and first launched in Japan on July 15, 1983, and was revised several times before being launched in America. For instance, originally, in the United States, it was going to be marketed as the Nintendo Advanced Video System Home Computer. Besides the light gun and controllers, it had a joystick and a keyboard, and it was being developed this way because in the United States of America at the time, video games were being looked at as a passing fad, a trend that had already worn out its welcome. This was in no small part due to very, very low licensing standards, leading to any developer being able to just simply develop a game and release it to most consoles. This is actually what led to the official Nintendo seal of approval and technology that locked out non-licensed games as to keep the reputation of Nintendo systems, well, good. There were, however, home computers that were marketed with games as well that were doing pretty decently. Originally, Nintendo intended to capitalize on that, but a year passed and they hadn't released the hardware, and instead showed a different piece of hardware off at the Consumer Electronics Show, the Nintendo Entertainment System. It retained a lot of the external design elements and is pretty much what got released. It was first run in a limited test launch of 100,000 systems in New York City, with a release date of October 18, 1985, and then through a series of marketing deals was rolled out to the whole country. The NES has an 8-bit microprocessor based on a MOS Technology 6502. It has 2 kilobytes of RAM, but a game cartridge itself can include RAM in order to expand the capabilities. Most commonly, it would expand to 128 to 384 kilobytes of RAM, but was pushed as high as a megabyte of RAM for Metal Slater Glory, a sci-fi adventure game that was never released in the United States. The NES displayed graphics at a resolution of 256 by 240. It could have up to 64 sprites displayed on screen at any time, at least without constantly reloading them, and it achieved this with such low specifications, even for the time, by using a custom-made second processor for video, which Nintendo called a picture processing unit, a PPU. A PPU has 3 different types of memory. First, it carried an additional 2 kilobytes of external RAM, as well as an additional 288 bytes of internal DRAM, specifically for sprites, and another 32 bytes of SRAM, specifically for the storage of color palettes. It has a hardware color palette of 54 colors. It could display 25 simultaneously, at least by default. If you knew some programming tricks, you could display more colors. And these palettes are not based on RGB, but rather NTSC, the standard for televisions in both Japan and the United States. In Japan, the Famicom had several different peripheral devices, but pretty much none of them were released outside Japan. They included a keyboard and even, believe it or not, a modem. The controllers were fairly basic, but looked quite space age at the time, with a D-pad, a select and a start button, as well as an A and B button. The color scheme of the Nintendo Entertainment System was quintessentially 80s. Black, gray, light gray, and red. Very stark edges, very high contrast. Where the Japanese version of the Famicom was a top-loading console, in which you would insert cartridges to a slot on the top of the console itself, the American version actually had a different mechanism. A lot of people look at it as a piece of the charm of the NES. The spring-loaded console tray was cool, it was fun to play with, but at the same time it slowly deteriorated and was considered a design flaw. That didn't stop the Nintendo Entertainment System from being a massive hit in the United States of America, and while other console manufacturers like Sega and NEC Home Electronics were launching 16-bit systems in 1988 and 1989, the Nintendo Entertainment System was actually still riding high. But eventually it was necessary for them to create a 16-bit product, and, well, they went above and beyond when they did. In Japan, the Super Famicom was released on Wednesday, November 21st, 1990. The 300,000 units sold out within a few hours. It caused such an issue with work schedules and people simply just being out, the Japanese government had to ask video game manufacturers to begin scheduling console releases on weekends. While it was not the first of the 16-bit video game consoles released, it was certainly the most powerful and contains several coprocessors that work alongside the CPU that do everything from sound to tiling to simulated 3D effects. It's really quite a complicated system. It had a palette of 32,768 colors, although it was only capable of displaying 256 at a time, and 8 channels of audio to play. It had a custom 68C816 running at 3.58 MHz for the CPU and 128 kilobytes of RAM. It had a max screen resolution of 512 by 448. Pretty much everything in the system represents a significant jump over the previous generation, and on top of that baked in the ability to add more chips, more processing power, more graphical capabilities via adding chips to the cartridges themselves. Now this was something that the NES did, but it expanded upon the ability to do this by quite a bit, adding some pretty beefy chips into some games. For instance, the Super FX chip, which is something that you will remember if you grew up in this era, was something that could add 3D effects to video games while still in the early 90s 16-bit era. It was like time traveling to the future. The chip itself was RISC-based, just like pretty much every other chip in the Nintendo canon as of this point, but it was used for 2 specific purposes: 3D polygons, of which it could render several hundred, as well as advanced 2D sprite effects. The most prominent examples of each are as follows. Star Fox is a 3D game rendered with polygons, and Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island scaled sprites so they could have bosses the size of most of the screen. The chip also enabled the ability to have multiple foreground and background parallax layers, which made the world seem to go on further and gave more illusion of depth. The Super Nintendo controller evolved from the original Nintendo's controller in that it added 2 front-facing buttons as well as 2 shoulder buttons. This allowed for quite a few new ideas to be incorporated, but it was more evolutionary than revolutionary. In both Japan and the United States, the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System both had a major advantage over its competition. In fact, during the 32-bit era, Nintendo basically declined. They said, "We don't really need to enter in anything into the 32-bit era. We are releasing games for our Super Nintendo that are still selling very well." And that's exactly what happened. They did really, really well with an underpowered system in a war that was starting to be about power. While the Super Nintendo did start off as a powerhouse, the PlayStation was much more of a powerhouse. But the games on the Super Nintendo were always up to a certain quality. Part of this is because the hardware was so well manufactured with the ability to add things when necessary. Everything was balanced very well and an experienced programmer was able to take advantage of it. But it wasn't just an issue of power in the strict technical sense of the word, but also an issue of the power that Nintendo held over third-party developers. They had expressed quite a bit of discontent by this point over their very strict licensing policies that Sony did not really have the same level of. The Super Nintendo did pretty damn good, but in the background, Nintendo was scheming. Frankly, they needed to be. An entire console generation was going on without their input, and although they were holding up, it wasn't going to stay forever. Silicon Graphics Incorporated was looking to get into the consumer market, and Nintendo was looking to get into the, well, beat everybody else in the video game market that was kind of starting to pass them by market. And I know that's not a real market. It's just a thing they were looking to do. These two companies formed a partnership that over a few years created Project Reality, which was renamed to Nintendo Ultra 64 and then renamed to Nintendo 64. Now, the Nintendo 64 starts to resemble a computer just a little bit more on account it's based on a Silicon Graphics workstation. It has a 64-bit NEC CPU in it, running at 93.75 MHz, which is a little less than 1/10 of a gigahertz, but at the time, frankly, this was quite good. It had a 64-bit Reality coprocessor. That's the specific chip developed by Silicon Graphics for Nintendo, specifically, and only ever used in the Nintendo 64 video game console. The Reality coprocessor itself had actually 2 pieces to it: the reality signal processor and the reality display processor. The signal processor handled a lot of 3D calculations such as anti-aliasing, texture mapping, depth buffering, and other pre-processing of graphics. The reality display processor was more geared towards the rendering of geometry. The Nintendo 64 was capable of creating 16-bit CD quality stereo audio. It was able to produce 16 to 24 different channels of audio with pitch shifting on any one of those channels, and had 4.5 megabytes of Rambus DRAM. This could be upgradable to 8 megabytes with an expansion pack. The Nintendo 64 was one of the first video game systems to use unified memory architecture. That is to say, instead of using different RAM for the CPU, the video, and the audio, it used one unified bank of RAM and was capable of several different resolutions, the highest of which was 720 by 576 widescreen. All of these add up to the system itself pretty much blowing everybody's mind. The Nintendo 64 controller was a total rethinking of the video game controller. It really looks bizarre now on account we've sort of developed way beyond the ideas here, but the idea was that you would be able to control this in different ways, using it in different ways. A game might, for instance, need the D-pad and the other buttons, or it could need the D-pad and the analog stick, or the analog stick and the buttons. There were a lot of different configurations, and that was the basic idea as to why they made something that looked like this. Although, yes, computers were making 3D games, and they were starting to look a lot nicer, the level this Nintendo console was operating on, seemingly smoothly and without much effort, was pretty foreign to how everybody in the United States and Japan really looked at things. Nintendo attempted to continue building upon this by creating something called the 64DD, which is a disc format that was actually writable. It was purporting itself to be an add-on platform that would allow to add creativity to gaming and thusly create more genres of games itself. It released in Japan and no one there liked it at all. It was not released in America, which is weird because there was a game called Mario Artist Game Maker. The Nintendo 64 enjoyed a nice long life, but they did eventually need to create a console that was more powerful, and Nintendo did just that. In 2001, both Japan and North America got the Nintendo GameCube. The GameCube was actually significantly more powerful than the Nintendo 64. It had a 485 MHz IBM PowerPC CPU and a 162 MHz ATI GPU that had some pretty significant upgrades. For one, it had 24 megabytes of SRAM in just the GPU. It had additional 3 megabytes of on-chip SRAM, 2 megabytes for the Z buffer and frame buffer, and 1 megabyte for the texture cache. It had 43 megabytes of total non-unified RAM, and a custom 81 MHz Macronix 16-bit digital sound processor. It was capable of 640 by 480 resolution, both in 480i and 480p, and in PAL regions was capable of 576i, as it had to generate 10 less frames per second. The GameCube controller took the Nintendo 64 controller ideas and made them into a more traditional looking controller, and it also did something very, very right. It had 2 analog sticks. The C buttons that were used in games like GoldenEye 64 as a means to strafe or look up and down gave them the idea of creating a C stick instead. Since that appeared to be the most logical usage of that real estate, why not go full bore in that direction? In a lot of ways, Nintendo's GameCube was a successor to the Nintendo 64 and kind of swooped in and gave an alternative to the Sega Dreamcast. There were enough similarities between the two systems that people sort of saw it as the next thing like that. And given that Sega got out of the hardware business at that time and started publishing games on the Nintendo GameCube, they were actually able to merge these audiences pretty well. The GameCube didn't really take the market share back as they had hoped it would, and they began to think that they needed to do something very different. They noticed the trend of the upcoming PlayStation and Xbox consoles was based around power, and they thought, well, what can we do different than that? They obviously did upgrade the power, moving to a PowerPC based Broadway CPU running at about 729 MHz, as well as an ATI Hollywood GPU running at 243 MHz. Wii ran on 88 megabytes of memory, which included 24 megabytes of SRAM and 64 megabytes of GDDR3 RAM. It had a Dolby Pro logic, stereo audio DSP. In all actuality, the specs inside resemble a slightly upgraded GameCube. This was good for developers on account it provided a much easier means of translating their skills in programming, but it also got Nintendo a lot of flack for not developing a particularly advanced console. Nintendo, like I said earlier though, had other plans. They created a motion controller for it called the Nunchuck. Now you could plug a game GameCube controller into it and play a game just like anything else, but using a gyroscope and an IR sensor, you were actually able to use motion controls. Now, the Nintendo Wii did significantly better than the GameCube, and the reason for this was it was geared towards the entire family. When they called it the Wii, well, it was spelled in a strange way. It was meant to be said like Wii, W-E. It conjured the idea that it was built for more people, and due to a combination of factors, for one, a low price due to not being the most powerful system on the market, and for two, the innovative ideas and features that created games that just weren't possible on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, the Nintendo Wii pretty much stomped the entire gaming industry when it came out. It eventually went on to sell 101 million consoles worldwide, but a persistent complaint with the Wii was that it was underpowered. It was the only system of its generation not to have HD graphics, and was constantly referred to as being in a different class as the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, a lower class, regardless of the fact it had sold significantly better than both. The next system Nintendo created was intended to capitalize on the success of the Wii, but also bring it into a more modern, quote-unquote, AAA friendly architecture, meaning it was able to make HD graphics, and although it wasn't quite as powerful as the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, it was quite a bit more powerful than the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. It certainly had enough to power games that were much more akin to what people wanted from Nintendo. The Wii U uses a processor codenamed Espresso that's based on a PowerPC 700 based tri-core processor that clocked at about 1.24 GHz. The GPU, codenamed Latte, contained two processors, a GPGPU, which ran all the applications, and a GPU, a more traditional GPU, which enabled backwards compatibility with Wii games. The former was considered the main chip. Obviously, it was significantly more powerful than a Wii emulating GPU, was based on the Radeon R600, R700 architecture, and was clocked at 550 MHz. The Wii U has 2 GB of DDR3 system memory, which is essentially unified memory, which it achieves by essentially putting everything into a memory pool. The Wii U could use nunchucks, it could use a Pro controller, which was much more akin to a traditional dual-stick controller at this point, and it also had something they called the Wii U gamepad, which was for all intents and purposes a tablet. The screen was not magnetically charged, so it didn't use electronic signals in order to do its touching. Instead, it was pressure sensitive, and it provided a lot of interesting ideas, like, for instance, having the inventory for whatever game you were playing on that screen, so the game on the main screen was never interrupted. Despite that being very cool, it wasn't something that people cared a whole lot about. The Wii U really wasn't a big enough step for Nintendo in a lot of ways. It wasn't particularly innovative. Yes, the tablet controller was a good idea, it was cool, it was nice, but it was also very expensive. The controller itself cost over $100 to replace or buy a second one, and due to the fact that it acted as a second screen that required system resources, wasn't incorporated in a whole lot of games. Although the Wii U finally had decent networking capabilities, it was pretty much like any other device, could connect to your Wi-Fi, could connect to Ethernet. It really felt like a catch-up system, and that's kind of what it was. It was Nintendo playing catch-up with a lot of the other things that were already out, and the games kind of reflected that. They were good, certainly a lot of them were great, better than a lot of other games, but were they innovative? Nintendo is a company that is known as an innovative company, and really just the next version of every game personified what the Wii U was. Here's the next thing. But this is also an area where I think everybody crossed a line that is pretty interesting. This is obviously a subjective thing, but hardware is starting to matter significantly less, and even though the necessity to upgrade is still there, the Wii U simply upgrading to be a competitive graphically system wasn't really enough for people to say, yeah, I need that. In fact, one could make an argument that the mainline consoles are more like PCs than they ever have been before, making them kind of just underpowered PCs. I'm pretty sure Nintendo caught wind of this on account when they announced the Nintendo Switch. It essentially freed everyone from the idea of a game console while providing something that was utterly different than the PC gaming experience. The Nintendo Switch console consists of an actual console, which could also be called called a tablet or a handheld on its own, and a dock, which the dock itself kind of charges it, plugs into various things, and is essentially used as the means to plug the gaming system into the TV. Now, interestingly enough, the handheld is also a dock for the controllers. The Joy-Cons, which are kind of a hybrid of a controller and the motion-controlled joystick, can be detached from the sides of the handheld and either used on their own or attached to a grip and used as a separate controller. The Nintendo Switch's innards were developed in partnership with NVIDIA. They're essentially an offshoot of the Tegra family of products and essentially works as a custom offshoot of the GeForce, but as a system on a chip. It has 4 ARM CPU cores, all clocked at 1.02 GHz, with the GPU clocked at 768 MHz. The Switch can connect to both Wi-Fi as well as another Nintendo Switch, and up to 8 people can play in a local setting that kind of emulates split screen, except for at the same time hides the screen from all the other competitors. It uses a USB-C connector to connect to the dock or charge the console. The Switch is not a tremendously complicated piece of hardware, however, it does actually do a pretty damn good job. As you've seen with games like Legend of Zelda, although there is some minor slowdown, it's a pretty complicated game that looks amazing and for the most part runs really well. They've gradually fixed a lot of the issues with it, showing that a lot of it was due to a lack of optimization in the software that they have been able to patch over, and also doing the normal Nintendo stylized look on just about everything, showing that style is very often much more of a priority for Nintendo anyhow, and outgunning more realistic graphics from the start. The Nintendo Switch does something that I think Nintendo needed to do desperately, and that's find some sort of angle that liberates gamers from a lot of the conventions they've been used to for many years, while at the same time providing a premium gaming experience. And although you're probably not going to compare to a massive computer that costs thousands of dollars, the Nintendo Switch, I think, understands the mainstream gaming market very well. If you recall, I made a video saying as such long before the Switch came out, explaining that I thought the market was pretty much primed for something that was exactly like the Nintendo Switch, and as it turns out, that's the case. Whatever Nintendo does in the future, obviously it's going to be interesting. The Switch did something similar to what the Wii did, which was sell very well and put them in a class of their own, but this time, it's not specifically because the system's weaker than the other ones. Yes, it certainly is weaker than the other main systems on the market right now, but we're now kind of living in a time period where that matters a lot less. Relatively speaking, all video game consoles are pretty powerful now. And on top of that, more and more developers are adopting style as a means to differentiate themselves from other developers, as opposed to endlessly attempting to cross the uncanny valley. I think this is a good development, and I'm very excited for what happens with the Nintendo Switch during its lifespan. Plus, the games that are already on it, although there aren't a huge number of them, are pretty damn good. Which era of Nintendo do you think was the absolute best? Do you harken back to fond memories of the GameCube, or do you have nostalgia? Get it? Like nostalgia with NES at the front. You get it. Leave us a comment, and if you enjoyed this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now would of course be a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every single day of the week, and the best way to see them first is a subscription. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on GameRanx.